let's dive right in. HTML, hypertext markup language. This is basically what pages are made of. And HTML is a way of structuring your pages. So this might look familiar to most of you. For those who don't know, this is HTML. And you can see that there's a little bit of a structure going on here with these tags. And some of them have a self-close, some of them close off. You can see this HTML, head, body, H1, P. And these tags are basically what makes up HTML. So HTML has this nesting structure that basically formats.
I have a package for you.
Excellent. So as we remember from 2 lectures ago, the server served the client, the browser, HTML. And inside HTML, we have nested a head, which is some information that won't usually be seen in the browser, by you at least, and the body. So this is the real meat of the stuff. This is the content. So inside the head is usually stuff about networks, or stuff that tells your browser or your computer what to do with this page. So inside the head we have a title. Inside this title we have lecture. Of course, that's not that useful to me. Inside the body, now remember, this is where the real stuff happens. This is what you see on a page. Inside we have an H1 tag, and we have a P. And in the header, we have, see, HTML gets real messy real fast. Day 3. And we have this HTML CSS. So this is the whole nesting structure that works with HTML. And that's just going to stay there. So yeah, and so you can see that here, the first line is this doc type HTML. And again, that just tells your browser that you're about to render HTML, what kind of HTML sometimes. Don't worry too much about that. If you put doc type HTML, you should be fine most of the time. HTML, so this is the main container. So as you can see, this is self-closing tag. Sorry, not self-closing tag. There's just a closing tag. And there's this indentation for everything that comes after. So head, body, and inside that, title, heading 1, paragraph. Does anyone have any questions about this? Okay, so with more complicated sites, with things, it's all basically this large structure system. So with New York Times, with this, it's, again, boxes, inside boxes, inside boxes, inside boxes. And again, HTML is this way of structuring your content. So all this content has its place on this page with its own box. So let's take a look at some basic HTML elements. Now, I'm not going to go through every HTML element because that would be terrible. That would just be like horrifying because there are a lot of them and you're not going to need to know all of them. The idea of today's lecture is hopefully to teach you about some of them, and in the future if you want to use whatever, you can go ahead, you can Google them, you can look them up, and then it'll be really easy from here on. So we have the, wow, that was fast. We have the HTML, the body, the head. These are the things that we just saw. Okay. We have the header tag. The P is the paragraph tag. Image tag, if you want to have an image on your page. Cool. And A is a hyperlink. So if you want to link something from one page to another. And a div. So these are the most important things you'll use in HTML because they're going to be everywhere and you're going to be really upset after a while. So divs are what structures your content. They're really, like, you use a lot of them, you put them inside each other, and they basically make up all those red boxes that we saw on the New York Times page. And then the span. So a span tag happens within a chunk of text, usually. So you have a paragraph, and if you wanted to make a section of it bold or red, you would put that little section inside a span tag. Anyone have any questions? Cool. All right. Moving on. We have an unordered list, a UL. And sometimes these tags work with other tags. So in this case, every list element is an LI. And you can see this is how you would set up a list of items. And on a web page, it would look like that. HTML attributes. So sometimes when you want to specify something more than just a text, this is the hypertext part, you might get something that looks like this. So you want to make a link to Google, and you're telling this tag, all right, here's a URL. This is what happened. And then when you render it, you get that really familiar Google with that underline under it. And now it's basically a link. There are a lot of other CSS attributes, HTML attributes. With divs, with a lot of these tags, you can have classes. These are basically ways of naming them. And we'll see how we're going to use these names later. So in this case, we have some text. We're going to apply a class to it, warning. And later we can then specify what this warning class will look like. Because remember, this is just HTML. And CSS will then make it pretty, make it look like things, add color. So right. So the basic format of an attribute is name, value, and that sits inside neatly a tag, and then there's the content. So there are also some HTML void elements. These are special elements. These are tags that don't have a closing tag. There's a lot of debate on whether or not to use a self-closing tag. Don't worry about that. But the idea is that you basically don't have any content for an image. Well, the image is the content. So you don't put a closing image tag. And there's also some things like input boxes. If you want to have a text field, you can just say type text, and then you leave it without a closing tag. And that's fine. Okay. So now we're going to look at how to go from an idea to a web page. So how do we take one of the ideas that we had earlier and turn it into a web page? Anyone know what the first thing you do is? Anyone? First thing you do? I see something there. Yes?
Do we add that dot there?
Even before that. Yes, let's do that. Cool. Let's draw an idea. So this morning, David and I were talking about this wonderful idea, and it's basically like Urban Dictionary. You guys all know what Urban Dictionary is? Do not know what Urban Dictionary is. Okay, it's a site with like lots of definitions for street talk or slang or whatever you want to call it. And we were like, hey, let's make like an Urban Dictionary for like Urban Dictionary translator, so that if you were in France, you could speak their native tongue, and however they talk. So, all right. So it's going to be. I'm going to call it street talk for tourists, because that'll catch on. Yes. Okay. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and start wireframing this out. And I think this camera's upside down. Okay. I'm just going to go ahead and start wireframing. All right. Oh, it looks like I'm done. Cool. So this is my wireframe. All right, excellent. So now I'm going to take this wireframe and turn it into HTML. And the thing I'm going to do is I'm going to think about that box structure and how I'm going to structure everything. So the first thing I notice on my wireframe is that I have a large middle chunk, and all my content sits in there. So I'm going to go ahead and just make that a div. I'm going to say that's going to be a container. The next thing I see is a lot of different rows of content. So even though this row isn't explicit, this is still kind of like if you think about structuring HTML rows. So I'm going to say this is going to be a div inside that div. This is going to be a div inside the main div. This is going to be a div inside the main div. All right, cool. So then I can go even more into these boxes. So street talk for tourists, that's going to be my logo or my header. These are my buttons, my navigation buttons, so that's going to be another div. This is the title of this feature box. Translate that slang. This is going to be another form element. And then I'm going to see, oh, here, there are two boxes here. So I'm going to make these two boxes side by side with two divs. And then, and again, all these little ones inside are their own elements. So yeah, so that looks pretty good. That looks like what an HTML site would look like. Yeah, cool. So now I actually need to take this and code it up into HTML. So I'm going to go back to my laptop here. And I'm going to go ahead and just try to make the site the way I would in HTML. So why is my mouse drifting upwards so? Cool. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with how to use a text editor or how this whole process might look like, the first thing I might do is open up my favorite text editor, Sublime, and I'm going to say doc type HTML, and then this is the HTML tags. And I'm going to go ahead and save this somewhere where I'll know where it'll be. So I'm going to go ahead and save in this convenient day 3 folder I have set up here. I'm going to call it 0.html for some reason. So I'm going to quickly just say head tag. And again, this is the title. This is for our browser. You'll see this later, but title, street talk for tourists. And then have a body tag. And body tag, I'm just going to quickly say hello. That's showing up fine. Cool. Alright, so now, if I open my Finder, if I go to, where did I save this? Desktop, day 3, 0. If I open with Google Chrome. Alright, so I can see, hey, there's my web page. There's HTML. It's working. That's cool. So I can now continue this whole process. And now I've conveniently, just now, scanned that wireframe. And now we can see it here. So I'm going to go ahead and say, okay, so this is a div. This is going to be a class container. I'm going to have a self-closing tag, a regular closing tag. And in the first row, we're just going to call it row. Other row. And the row. So these are the green boxes. Okay. So now in the top row I have a header. So I'm going to call that H1, street talk for tourists. And then I'm going to choose to make these 2 buttons a list element. And that's part of just the semantics of HTML, and treating it as a list will allow me to do a couple of things. One, recognize that there can be multiple of these buttons, or later if I wanted to add more, just go ahead and add more to navigation. So I'm going to say the first item is about, and then the second item is the login button. Cool, so that's my header. All right, my next row. This time I'm going to use a second header tag, so that's H2. So that's just a little bit smaller, and that just tells the browser that, okay, it's going to be not as prominent as the first header. Translate that slang. Form, and now this is a form. So a form contains input elements. A form can contain a drop-down. Drop-down looks like select, options, first link, and then tab, and then close off this tag. All right, and then underneath it, I have a button. So I'm just going to go ahead and say button. Go. All right, does this look okay for everyone so far? Like, you guys don't have to follow along this at all, or type it, but just does the structure make sense to people?
It should be optional.
You're right, I did not. Does this still look right? Cool. All right, moving on. So next we have these 2 more divs. So div, I'm going to call this a feature. I promise you I'm not going to put out everything. Just going to show. Again, I'm going to step down one size even smaller. This is now going to be an H3. And then I'm going to have another set of lists. Yoda. Yoda. Shelfie. So yeah, so there's another box here. I'm not going to worry about that too much. Of the, oh, the day. That's cool. The day. All right. So now if I take a look at this, if I go and refresh this page, hey, that looks like my page. Almost there. So this is setting up the structure of the page, but now we actually need to CSS it. That's going to be a word. CSS it. We're going to style it. So CSS, wow, let me just grab. Okay, so CSS stands for cascading style sheets. And again, it's a way of making things pretty. It's a way of making things look not just like plain text, and you can add a lot of different ways of setting up your layout. So we saw earlier that everything was just kind of linear. And that's because of a bunch of rules that the browser by default places on your HTML. So let's take a look at a little bit of CSS. So this is a simple CSS rule. There are a lot of different components to this. The first one is a selector that tells us what class to apply to, or sorry, what element to apply to. So in this case, it's just going to directly apply this entire declaration to the paragraph tag. So everything inside any paragraph tag will have these rules. These rules, that's the property, that's the value, and that's a semicolon. Don't forget that semicolon. And again, you have this indentation structure. So with HTML, the way that we usually do it is we indent by hitting spaces twice, like space, or if you have it set up, your tab might space twice. I don't know, what do you guys do for CSS? Similar things? Yeah. Space, or tab with 2 spaces. So yeah, so this is the rule that we saw earlier, and this is 2 paragraph tags. And can we see that on the side, what it looks like? Cool. Alright, so here's a little bit paragraph, and both these paragraphs don't have any stylings on it. Is that right? Yes, it does. These paragraphs have the style on it. Alright, so now we go to the next one. We can then specify a class to this paragraph. Right, so this is going to be our intro. And as you can see here, this rule is now only applied to the one with the class. Okay. We can look at an ID, similar to the next one. It looks exactly the same. With an ID, you specify it with a hashtag, or a pound sign, or whatever you want to call it nowadays. Yeah, and remember, with a class, you have to specify with a dot in front of it. And with an ID, it's a little tic-tac-toe thing. Yeah. Does this make sense to people so far? Anyone kind of lost? All right, cool. So again, what's the difference between IDs and classes? Well, IDs you should only use once. So any element can only have one ID, and in a document, an ID can only appear once. So that means that you are really, really trying to say that this one element is going to be styled like this. Whereas for a class, you might have multiple boxes. We saw earlier, I named a bunch of classes rows because they have the same property. They're all kind of row-like boxes. These classes can be applied to multiple elements, and you can use multiple classes on one element. So like this, with a space in between. So div class equals alert good, and in that case, we have both the alert class and the good class. So we can have 2 separate CSS rules that apply to the same element. Anyone see a lot of weird looks? Being weird, or is this? Yeah. All right. So okay, so let's look at a bunch of different font and text properties. And again, I promise you, I'm not going to go through all of them. The thing to do here is that if you find that you want to make a text sparkly, or you want to make it like glow red, you go on Google, you look at how to make CSS text glow red, and you can find a bunch of these. So I'm going to go ahead and say, all right, I'm going to style a div. I'm going to make the color whatever that color is. In CSS, they take in hex values for colors. So the first 2 are RGB. Again, you can look this up. Font family. Font family is a series of fonts your browser is going to try to use. So first it's going to try to use Times. And if your computer doesn't have Times, it's going to fall back to Georgia. And then if your computer doesn't have Georgia, it's going to fall back to any serif font, your computer's default serif font. Font size, you can specify how large you want your font to be. Font weight, there are different kinds of weights. There's bold, there's normal. For some fonts, they even come with numeric weights like 100, 200, 300, all the way to 900. Text align, that aligns the box, the text inside your box. Text decoration, some fancy things that you might not need. And text transform, a bunch of other fancy things that you may or may not need. So by default, some of these are already turned on or turned off. Like so for a link, by default when you style a link, before you even style a link, you just have it on HTML, there's going to be a default property of text decoration underline. Because that's how we're used to seeing it. And that's a thing that the browser does. So we can remove it by saying text underline is text decoration is none. And again, you'll see that later. So what does that CSS look like? Actually, does anyone remember what that CSS looked like? Can anyone name all the rules that was on there before? Okay, can anyone name all the rules in one sitting? This is like, I'm saying this for a reason. Does anyone think they can name all the rules in one sitting? Anyone want to try? It's this one chance thing. You got to get it right, or the whole class like looks down at you. No pressure. Anyone? Going once. What could be in this envelope? Going once. Going twice. You want to try? Okay.
And then that was it. There's only two things that good. Oh, the class.
Yeah. Anyone want to help him out?
Okay.
All right, we're gonna move on. We'll try this again later. So it looked like that. There's a bunch of underline, text align center. I don't remember even times. Red, 50-point font. Something like that. But the point is you didn't get it, so that's it's okay. We'll work on this. So that was a bunch of font and text properties. Let's look at some more. Usually the more confusing properties. These are display properties. So by default, divs are blocks. And what that means is that they will take up however much space they can take up. So if we go to the next one, this little bit will look like that. So hello world, and the world isn't a div, so it'll extend to the side of the pages, and the div has a background of red. Again, if you apply this display block rule to it, nothing will change because it's already like that. So a very important display property that you should know is inline. And inline basically takes the div element and makes it in line, like it makes it in the line. So go to the next one. You can see that by applying this, it then moves this div to the line, hello world, in the same line. So making it inline means that if we try to apply a width or a height to it, it won't do anything, because when it's inline, the containing div will shrink to the size of your content. So go to the next one. Yeah, it's this exact same. So if we do want this box to be a certain dimension, and we still want it to be horizontally in place, so like hello world, we can then make it inline block, which makes it inline, but in a block. So it will look like nothing. There we go. You might want to just cue up the next one. Yeah. Okay. So we have these three properties. These three are the ones that you're going to see again and again. That's block, inline, and inline block. And again, block takes up the whole width. Block takes up as much as it can. Inline, you can do different things with it. And then inline block, you can actually have a block inside the inline element. Okay. Does anyone have any questions about that? Usually when people start getting amused. Cool. Okay. In CSS, there's this thing called a box model. And And so we have a div. Inside it we have best box. And the div has a border of 1px, 1 pixel, solid red. Can we see that? Okay, that's what it looks like. You have the whole div. Remember, the whole div is stretched out because it's large. It has solid around it, a solid border, and it's red. Another way of saying this is by breaking it up to each of these 3 elements. So 1px solid red, we're going to break it up by saying border style, solid, border color, red, border width. And that will look, sorry, let me go back. That'll look exactly the same. And again, this is just if you wanted to, for some reason, change different values. We'll see that in the next slide. So for this one, you see that now I have 1px, 1 pixel, and 3 pixels. And so that's a way of saying the first value corresponds to the top and bottom of your border, and the second value corresponds to the right and the left. So if we see that now, what that looks like, you see that the left and right borders are larger, because those are 3 pixels. Cool. If you wanted to specify each one of the sides, you can say all 4 values. You can say 1, 3, 1, 3. And again, that goes clockwise from the top one. So 1 pixel, 3 pixel, 1 pixel, 3 pixel. And again, that looks exactly the same. You can also just specify one border. So border bottom, again, with the similar 3 value thing that we saw earlier. So that would look like that. Okay. So this is the very general way of specifying values for your properties. So you can apply this thing where you have all 4 sides. You can apply this whole border idea to a lot of other different things, such as margin. So margin specifies the amount of space around a box. So if I have 2 boxes beside each other, it says, hey, I need this margin of 10 pixels, and it's going to be outside there. Again, 1 pixel that has that border. Padding. So padding is inside. It's the space between the content and the border. So if we kind of sum all that up, this is what a container would look like. So you have your border, you have the content. Between the content and the border is your padding. Between the border and the margin, and everything else outside the world is your margin. Does anyone have any questions about this? Yes?
So what happens if you want to display the content in the top left corner of the heading?
In the top left corner of the padding. And so for that, so by default, there's constrained to the height of their content. So unless you specify, so if you specify the height to your div, it's always going to be the top left. But otherwise, it's like squished. And if you want to specify the left and right, you can use something like text align in the box, text align left, text align center, text align right, justify. Does that make sense? Do you have a question?
So does this work with block inline? Because like if you do margin with
yes.
With like
Yes. Yes, I believe it does work with block. With block inline, when you have multiple elements beside each other, the margins will collapse. So when you have if you have two elements and you have a margin here and a margin here, they will basically move towards each other until one of their margins hits. Like no, I need that much space. So it won't actually be like double the margin. Does that? Right, yeah, cool. Any other questions? Those are good questions. Okay, you'll figure a lot of this stuff out. You'll start, getting super frustrated. You'll look online, and within seconds you'll probably still not get it, but you'll get it. Okay, so CSS positioning. So CSS positioning is a really scary creature because the idea of positioning things or structuring things should be done by this HTML guy. And if you're shifting things around, you have to be very, very careful to not disrupt the whole layout of the page. So by default, divs are position relative. So that means that they will sit where they want to sit. I'm gonna sit here where I'm gonna be where I want to be. So elements are gonna flow naturally on the page. So if I have two divs on top of each other, it's gonna look like that. So here's the text. So now, if I maintain these two, if I maintain that, and if I say top 20 pixels, it's gonna move the content box down 20 pixels. It's gonna move it 20 pixels down from the top, from its up above it. It's a little interesting. It's gonna move it down 20. And again, if you want to move to the right, you can say left. If you want to move to the left, you can say right or negative 10 pixels. So now we have position absolute. So position absolute, what it does is instead of moving it where it started, it's going to look to its parent. So it's going to look to the HTML element just above it. It's going to use that as origin, as its 0. So then it's going to say, okay, so the thing above it is the body. Right? So now it's going to look at where the coordinates of the body are, and it's going to say, okay, I'm going to move 10 pixels down from the top left corner of body. So then we have this. And you can see now that the text is actually overlapping, which can totally happen. Okay. And then we have fixed. So when a content element is fixed, it's going to be relative to the page, to the whole window. And it's always going to be relative to the window. So now if you scroll on that page, you can see that bloop is always there in the top left corner. That's placeholder text, by the way. That's lower so you can go online and get a lot of it. It's kind of funny looking, but it fills your text where you don't have text yet. All right, cool. Does anyone have any questions about positioning? Yes. Ooh, okay. Is top and margin the same? So, that's the best way to explain that. So when you have two elements and you specify a top, right? So that's shifting it down, but the bottom elements might not change because it might still be sitting where it's supposed to sit, right? Because again, we talk about this whole flow, and all you're doing is you're shifting this one box when you use relative. With margin, if you push the entire box down, everything underneath it will also move down with you. So if we're making like a page with a good flow, you generally want to think about using margins to space your things out. Because you don't want to have to continuously add like amounts to lower even lower divs. Question? Yes?
Okay, so like an actual box for the elements after it will think that the box is where it originally was, right?
For
we
relative,
don't use
yes.
top, bottom, left, right spacing?
Yes.
Yeah.
For relative.
Yeah.
Am I wrong? Yes. No, it's good. For absolute position, no. For absolute, they'll take the element entirely out of the picture. Okay, good questions. Any other questions? Cool. Again, quick recap. CSS position, header, content, relative, moving it down. Absolute to parent, 10 pixels. Now you'll notice that when it's absolute, it actually the div actually like shrinks. That's because it no longer has a clue of what's the max it can go to. It's a really interesting rule that it'll shrink to the size of the content. Fixed, it's now relative to the window element. 10 pixels. Cool. Any questions? Cool. All right. So let's take our street talk for tourist website, and now let's quickly add some CSS. So I'm gonna mirror my screen again. All right, and again, I promise you I won't go through everything. find my cheat sheet. You won't have these when you're making your website. Okay, so, all right, so the first thing I want to do is, so we have this page, and you can see that by default, the browser has applied a bunch of styles to it. So it knows that the H1 tag is going to be big, and it knows that this whole list item is going to be in this list format, and it knows that the H2 tag is going to be a little smaller, and the H3 tag is going to be smaller. Actually, it's kind of nice that you can see the text grow a little bit smaller every time. So the first thing I want to do is I want to remove all of that. So I have, or I might not. Okay, you guys are going to see everything, all the spoilers. That's okay. So I have this reset file, and this reset file is super useful because basically what it is it defines a bunch of rules and it clears it to all 0. So the first thing I want to do when I'm making a page is I want to use some sort of reset file or something that makes me feel a little bit better about the CSS that I'm going to write. So I'm going to go ahead and link that file in. So to do that, I can say link. Anyone know what href stands for, by the way? Because for a link tag, you see it. You see a, href, something, something. Sorry? Yes, hypertext, hyperlink reference. Hyperlink reference. Hypertext reference. Yes. I don't know why you need to know that. You don't. So I'm going to say reset.css, and I'm going to say type text CSS. Okay. So that should clear all my file name. And it doesn't. It's because it's probably in the wrong folder. Oh, it's in the right folder. Okay, cool. So now, this is what my site now looks like. I think I got a little further from where I wanted to be, but it's okay. Steph, can you point this page on the side monitors? Okay. So, as I go through this now, you see that there's a couple of different ways to add CSS to your document. The first way is what I did, is I linked it to an external style sheet. So I added a reference to another page. That's one way of doing it. Another way is by directly indicating styles on this page. This is generally like practice that's kind of frowned upon, but I'm going to do it anyway. So I'm going to start with the container. If you could just periodically, whoa, how did you get that? If you could just periodically refresh. So. Can we go that page 0? Right. Cool. So the first thing I want to do is I'm looking at my site and I want to have this box of, let's say, 800 pixels wide in the center. So the first thing I want to do is this container. So I'm going to tell the container to be width 800, and then margin. So I'm using margin for this, 0 and auto. So now if you remember earlier, if I have two numbers, the first number refers to top and bottom, and the second number refers to left and right. So this will basically, this little 0 auto will basically say that, okay, top and bottom 0, I don't care about that, up and right is going to be auto. So it's gonna make it the same. So it's gonna make it centered. So if you refresh that now, nope. All right. This is why I have this here. Is your browser too small? Is your window? Can you try zooming out? Nope. Okay, so another interesting tool is called the element inspector. So we mentioned this earlier, but if you take a look, So what Steph is looking at right now is she did that click thing. So in most browsers you can go to developer console. In this one you can just hit a shortcut, Command I think Charles mentioned. And you can go ahead and look at the properties of each of these divs. And you can see that here, all the elements are really nicely laid out. So, there we go. What happened? Okay, so yeah, so the screen was just less than 800 pixels, so it was filling the whole screen. So I'm gonna, yeah, so I'll keep that there like that. And so yeah, so you can see that, actually you can also see the elements. You can also see the CSS rules. No, bring it back up. You can also see the CSS rules that are being applied. So width 800, margin 0 auto. Cool. So let's keep on going. So look, we have a row. A row is kind of boring. We'll move on from there. But we have the header tag. So for that, we're going to say font size 500, 50. We're going to say red color. Red. Please don't actually make your sites like this. This is going to look terrible. Who knows what's going to happen? We'll see. So again, I'm going to specify this whole unordered list box. So I'm going to use this thing called float, and you should use this very carefully. Because what it's going to do is going to push everything to the right, and then yeah, let's see what that looks like. Nope, nothing. Okay, cool. So yeah, so you can see that I styled that. It moved to the right. We're going to call this actually header. We're going to call the first header box. We're going to give it a color of steel blue. We're going to make it have a padding of 10 pixels on all sides, and we're going to apply an element. We're going to apply a list element. We're going to say border 1 pixel, solid, and black. We're also going to make these elements, right now, by default, again, they're stacked one on top of the other. We're going to make it display, inline, block. Alright, so I'm going to try that. Cool. So you can see what happened here. When I styled the list, it also styled a bunch of other things that I didn't want to be styled. Because it applied to all the list elements. It applied to all the unordered list elements on the list elements. So you can see here that originally I wanted this nice little structure. Now it's kind of pushed to the corner there to the right. It's okay, we'll work on that later. So, again, we have the header, we have the second one, that's that little translate, that slang box. Let's say we're going to text decoration, we're going to do, text transform, uppercase. So, again, you want to specify, you want to use HTML to specify content, and you want to use CSS to sort of make it pretty, make it look different. And again, so that makes it uppercase, as opposed to just typing uppercase letters. We're going to say text align center, and yeah, and again, it looks like this is centered, so we're going to apply the centering to actually the row itself. We're going to say text align center. We're going to put below this. We're going to put this below the header, so we're going to put a margin bottom on the header of let's say 20 pixels, and we're going to put a quick background color on all the rows, and we're going to make it very light gray. And again, you can specify 3 letters for CSS instead of the 6 traditional RGB text values. If you want to just condense it, it will repeat the 3 letters again. So yeah, so all right. So I've got a ways to go, but it's okay. We're going to move beyond that box. Cool. So we're going to look at the second one. So I'm going to give this unordered list a class now. I'm going to call it nav for navigation. And now I can specify this. I can be a little bit more specific with this element. So instead of just saying UL, I can say UL.nav. And that's basically saying that it's going to look in the UL element with the class of navigation. Now, so if I look at this now, it will only apply it to nothing. Apply it to nothing. Sorry. Okay, so this is sort of one of another way of selecting CSS is that what happens here is that it looks into UL nav, so it looks into the unordered list, and inside that list, it looks at the list element inside that list. Does this make sense? Are you confused? A little bit?
Raise your hand.
Yeah, raise your hands if you're confused, please. You look confused? Which part?
Let's see. Yeah, why are you doing this straight in the HTML file as the CSS file?
That's a very good question. I have no idea. You should be doing it in a CSS file. I just didn't feel like navigating between two pages. And I felt like
It's easier, like.
I didn't want too many things flickering on the screen. That's a big screen.
All right.
I don't know how it would look. You should put it in a CSS file. You should move it to your own CSS file.
Then how do you know what in your CSS file? How do you know what style you're going to map to certain headers or certain parts of the certain computers? Like how are you doing that here?
I'm doing it here because I'm specifying. So in my HTML, see, I can just scroll down and look at it. In my HTML, I have this div class container, and to apply rules to that class of container, I'm saying, yeah. Question. Yes.
Then why you put all the definition on the bottom instead of I mean, why you define that, for example, left into the bottom of the page of the code instead of you define it in the first. I mean the second.
Are you saying the order I put the rules in? Okay, so the order for the most part doesn't matter until it does, but it doesn't matter. So usually there's just a bunch of like things that you go from. So I for some reason like putting container at the very top, and then I go H1, H2, H3, and then I go like paragraph or texting styles, and then afterwards I have all my containers and rules. But it's up to you. Usually there are certain ways of doing it. I just chose to order it this way. Does that make sense? There's no real order. Any other questions? Yes.
What are the overloading rules if you
Okay, so if you define things twice, there are a bunch of these rules that you can look up online. But the idea is that the more specific your selector is, like, it wins. So in this one, I'm selecting this list element with UL, nav, and then li. If I were to write a rule under it, that was just li, and then I said border, 2 pixels, solid, blue, this won't show up. Because the rule above it is a lot more specific. So, oh my god, it did. Oh wait, no it didn't. Sorry. It showed up to the other ones and not for the nav bar elements. Because the other ones are also list elements. Does that make sense? You can think about it like points, and actually I think that on the site, on a bunch of sites, they actually call it points. But every time you give a selector a name, like every time you refer to its parent, like you get like 10 points, and then one with the most points is the one that takes the style. That makes sense? You might have to fidget around with that when you start coding your sites, but okay. Any other questions?
Anyone has any questions?
All right. So I'm gonna. So our time is up. So we did that. We added CSS. So after lunch, we'll have a lecture on JavaScript and Node. And if you're bored during lunch, or if you're just kind of curious and want to play around, we have these awesome HTML CSS exercises that were made by Xander and Felix last year. You can go ahead and try them. You can raise your hand. We'll be kind of wandering around. We can help with it. You know, if you just want to try things, learn some HTML, CSS.